The first thing I wrote in the duty log the morning we reached Kerath Station was the station's registration number, ESC0041KRT, then the date of arrival, then the name of our vessel and my rank and my name. It was the kind of rote notation a junior officer writes before anything has happened. Because the regulations require it, because the forms have columns and the columns expect to be filled. I wrote it out in the careful block lettering they teach you at the academy, and I remember thinking, even then, with the telemetry still cold and the debris field still beyond the sensor threshold, that whatever I wrote next in that log was going to be read by people I would never meet, for reasons I could not entirely predict, and that I should write it honestly. I have tried to do that. My name is Soren Vale. At the time of these events, I held the rank of Cadet Lieutenant, a grade that exists at the precise inflection point between being trained and being trusted, close enough to command to perform its duties, distant enough from it to carry no formal authority over anything that mattered. I was 23 years old. I had been posted to EFS Kerath Measure 11 months prior, fresh from the orbital posting at Callisto Station, where I had spent a year doing nothing more consequential than logging supply manifests and calibrating the secondary navigation arrays. The posting had been routine in the way that first postings often are, an opportunity to develop habits, to learn the discipline of observation, to understand what it meant to be responsible for information, even when the information was not interesting. I had been good at it. My evaluations said so, in the careful institutional language evaluations use, and my commanding officer at Callisto had told me in plainly human language, on my last day there, that I had a feel for documentation, and that documentation, done right, was not a small thing. I thought about that conversation a great deal in the months that followed. The Kerath's Measure was a survey and relay vessel, one of the mid-tier workhorses of the External Settlement Command, a ship designed to cross long distances, take readings, maintain contact with outlying civilian infrastructure, and report back, not a warship, not remotely a warship. We carried 4 defensive arrays and a crew of 112, and we were, in the estimation of most people who gave us any thought at all, one of the least dramatic postings in the fleet. The work was measurement. The work was communication. The work was being present where events were happening and sending accurate records of those events to people who needed them. I understood this. I found it at 23 mostly satisfying and occasionally tedious, and the ratio shifted with the week, which is precisely why we were the first ship on scene. When Kerath Station went silent, the External Settlement Command needed eyes at the location before it could commit anything larger. The larger ships were allocated. The Kerath's Measure was available in the right sector and crewed by people whose function was to observe and report. So we went. I want to be precise about what that silence was before I go further, because in the months and years that followed, there were simplifications offered about the Varrock Syndicate's conduct that stripped the mechanism of its specificity, and the specificity is what makes it what it is. The Varrock did not bomb Kerath Station. They did not assault it in any conventional sense of the term. They did not fire a weapon at it, or board it with soldiers, or destroy its infrastructure through any process that would have registered on a long-range threat monitor. What they did was quieter, more deliberate, and in certain ways that I still find difficult to articulate 14 years later, more thorough. Kerath Station was a civilian resupply hub at the edge of the Kalius Expanse, a Class 3 installation built to support the mining and transport traffic that moved through the outer corridors of that region. 31,412 people lived and worked there at the time the Varrock Syndicate initiated what they called, in their own records, Assimilation Protocol 11. It was a family station in the way that all such stations become over decades. Mechanics and haulers and administrators and teachers and children and the elderly, a community of people who had chosen an outlying life and built something coherent from it. The station had its own school. It had a medical bay with 12 beds and a surgical suite that had been updated 3 years prior. It had a commissary and a small park deck on level 7 with real soil brought up from the surface of Kalius 9 and an ornamental fountain that ran recycled water. I know these details because I read the ESC infrastructure reports during our transit to the station, filling the hours with the methodical habit of knowing what I was approaching, and those details are the ones that have stayed with me. What the Varrock did, beginning approximately 14 months before the station went silent, was infiltrate it at the biochemical level. They were a cephalopoid hive intelligence. The designation took the xenobiological team 2 weeks to arrive at with any confidence, and even then they offered it with qualifications. The Varrock Syndicate had existed in a dormant state for what their own records later indicated was approximately 6,000 years, suspended in a dispersed colony form in the deep cold beyond the Caelus Expanse outer boundary. They woke early. We never determined why. The xenobiologists argue about it at length and produced several competing theories, none of which I found convincing, and none of which mattered to the 31,000 people who were already dead by the time anyone was able to argue about anything. When the Varrock woke, they assessed. That is the clinical word, and it is the correct one. They did not panic. They did not immediately attack. They observed the traffic in the corridor, cataloged the infrastructure, and selected a target that offered the combination of isolation, organic mass, and structural accessibility that their Protocol 11 required. Kerath Station met all 3 criteria. It was distant from any rapid response asset. It housed 31,000 biological organisms whose chemistry the Varrock had sufficient time to analyze through passive observation. And its pressure seals and ventilation architecture, while adequate for standard environmental maintenance, had no provision for what the Varrock introduced. A complex enzymatic dispersant they had apparently developed or carried from a prior assimilation event somewhere in their 6,000-year history. The dispersant was introduced through the water recycling intake over a period of months. It was calibrated to operate below the threshold of the station's standard chemical monitors, not through any particular cleverness about the station system specifically, but because the Varrock had apparently done this before, at some point in the deep past, to species whose monitoring capabilities were broadly analogous to humanity's, and they had learned the margins. The dispersant did not kill. It altered. Over exposure periods of several weeks, it began modifying the cellular architecture of any biological organism that ingested it, restructuring connective tissue and neural pathways in ways that prepared the host body for a second process. The second process was the assimilation itself. I am not going to describe it in technical detail because I spent 3 days in the xenobiology bay reading the reconstructed sequence, and I am not a xenobiologist and my summary would be imprecise. What I will say, because I believe precision here is a form of honesty, is that it was not quick and it was not painless, and the Varrock's own records, which we recovered later, logged the duration of each individual assimilation event. With the same notational indifference they applied to everything else. Each entry was numbered. The numbers ran from 1 to 31,412. They called each person a substrate unit. The legal mechanism they constructed around this was a bureaucratic artifact of extraordinary cynicism that I have thought about many times since, and that I believe was designed precisely because the Varrock had, during their long dormancy, developed some capacity to observe the interstellar commons framework under which human outlying settlements operated. Kerath Station's registration under the Interstellar Commons Settlement Charter required annual renewal. The station had consistently renewed, year after year, for 26 years. 9 days before the Varrock began their Protocol 11 introduction sequence, the station's administrative officer filed the renewal paperwork with the incorrect processing code. A clerical error. The kind that gets corrected the following week with a quick transmission and a resubmission. Kerath Station's administrator had in fact already drafted the correction, and it was sitting in the outbound queue when the dispersant reached its first effective concentration in the water supply. The Varrock filed a document with the Commons Registry the day after the lapse threshold crossed. It was a claim document, under their interpretation of Commons abandoned property provisions, an interpretation that would later be determined by the Commons Legal Tribunal to be fraudulent retroactively for whatever that judgment was worth to anyone. A settlement installation that had lapsed in its registration could be classified as unclaimed infrastructure. The biological inhabitants of unclaimed infrastructure, Under a provision the Varrock had apparently located in an obscure annexure of the Common Salvage Code that predated human membership by 2 centuries, could be filed as unclaimed organic salvage pending assimilation by a registered syndicate entity. The Varrock Syndicate was a registered entity under the Commons framework. They had registered on the same day they woke from dormancy. That registration had not been reviewed by any human administrator because the volume of registration filings in the outer sectors was enormous, and the review process was automated, and the Varrock's filing contained no flags that the automated system was designed to detect. 31,412 people filed as unclaimed organic salvage on a 9-day registration technicality. I went over this sequence so many times during the 11 days before the engagement that I could reconstruct it from memory without reference to the file, and I did reconstruct it, sitting in the officer's mess on the 3rd night of transit, writing it out longhand on a notepad in the block lettering from the academy, as if the act of writing it again might produce some new clarity I had missed the first 11 times I had processed it. It did not produce new clarity. What it produced was the same sequence in a different hand and the same specific gravity at the end of it. 9 days. That was the distance between 31,000 people who were alive and 31,000 people who were substrate units numbered in ascending order. 9 days in a wrong processing code in an outbound queue. We reached the debris field at 061 for hours, ship time, and I was on the bridge because it was my watch, and because Captain Adisamaro had pulled me from the rest rotation 2 hours early and told me in the quiet voice she reserved for things she had already decided, I needed to hear directly that I should be present when we got there. She was a compact woman of about 50 with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who has been in charge of dangerous situations often enough that stillness is no longer a performance but a default. She had been commanding the Kerath's measure for 7 years. She knew her ship's function, and she knew what documentation meant in contexts where it was the primary thing a vessel could contribute, and she had decided I should understand that function at first hand rather than through a summary briefing read after the fact. She did not explain this to me in those words. She said, "Be on the bridge." I was on the bridge. The viewport over the forward station shows a broad arc of space ahead, and when we came out of transit, the station was not there. What was there was a field of material distributed across an area roughly 1.5 times the station's original footprint. The component elements of Kerath Station's infrastructure reduced by the assimilation process to what the censors classified with clinical neutrality as biological industrial composite debris. The fountain, the school, the 12-bed medical bay. The 70 years of accumulation, a community of 31,000 builds around itself. The Varrock's assimilation process did not simply consume the biological material. It integrated it into a substrate mass that was then deployed as feedstock for their own colony extension process. What was left behind was the residue that the process could not use. Structural alloys, polymer sheeting, some electrical components, a quantity of soil from level 7 that had been rejected at the screening stage because its mineral composition did not match the Varrock's biochemical requirements. I stood at the viewport and looked at it for a long time. Behind me, the sensor operators were running their scans, and the communications officer was recording the standard contact ATM protocol, and the ship's physician, Dr. Nena Osi, had come up from medical and was standing at the secondary station reading the biological analysis on the debris composition because that was her job, to understand what had happened to human beings. And she did it without looking away. I watched her for a moment. She was perhaps 45, from Lagos originally, with the methodical precision of someone's son who had built a discipline of observation over many years of practice. She read the analysis, and she logged her notes, and she did not speak. And the shape of her concentration, the way she held herself in front of display without pulling back from it, without giving herself any of the small physical permissions people give themselves when they need distance from something, was one of the things I wrote about in the duty log later, in the notation field, trying to find words for what professional discipline looks like when it is in contact with something enormous. Captain Morrow stood at the center of the bridge with her hands clasped behind her back and said nothing for 11 minutes. Then she said, "Cadet Lieutenant Vael, you have the duty log." I understood what she meant. It was not a routine delegation. She was handing me something. I wrote, "Arrived Kerath Station, coordinates 0614 hours. Station ESC 0041 KRT not present at location. Debris field consistent with Class 3 installation structural components plus anomalous biological composite residue occupying 1. 4 times original station footprint, no life signs, no emergency beacons, no response to contact protocol, initiating debris analysis and sector scan." Then I closed the log for a moment and stood at the viewport and thought about what I was going to write when the analysis was complete. I thought about those 31,000 registration numbers that would never be filled in under survivors. I thought about the 9 days. I thought about the clerical errors sitting in the outbound queue. I thought about the administrative officer who had filed that wrong code. I did not know her name yet that morning. I learned it later from the population registry. Tamsin Orval, 41 years old, 11 years at the station, and I thought about what she would have made of that error in the subsequent weeks. Whether she had been one of the earlier numbers or one of the later ones, whether the wrong processing code was something she was thinking about when the second process reached her. Then I went back to the log and kept writing. We spent 18 hours at the debris field. During those 18 hours, the ESC relay we had pinged on arrival transmitted back a priority-coded response that redirected our standard incident report up 3 levels of command simultaneously. 40 minutes after that first redirect, a second relay carried a message from ESC Fleet Coordinator Vanthi Krishnamurti, whom I had never heard of before that morning, addressed to Captain Morrow, classified above my clearance level, that the captain read at her station with her back very slightly turned. She did not share its contents with me. She shared them with no one on the bridge. She read it, placed the tablet face down on her console, and said, "Continued debris documentation. All data to primary archive, secondary archive, and the relay buffer. 3 copies. No exceptions. We documented everything." I wrote 14,000 words in the duty log that day. Every piece of debris we could scan and characterize. Every biological signature. The recovered fragments of administrative records from the station's data core, partial, corrupted, but enough to reconstruct the population registry and cross-reference it against the Varrock's own filed documentation, which the ESC legal team had by then pulled from the Commons registry and transmitted to us for reference. I read that documentation during my meal break, sitting alone in the small officer's mess with a cup of something warm I did not taste. And I read the list of 31,412 substrate units, numbered in ascending order. And I read the specific entry for substrate unit number 1, which the Varrock's records indicated had been the station's school principal, a woman named Faranaz Ahmadi Keller, 62 years old, and the entry for her was 4 lines of biochemical notation and a processing duration. I am aware that I am telling this slowly. I am doing it deliberately. The story that came after, the story that everyone knows or thinks they know, moves very fast in the retelling. And I think the speed of it is a kind of lie. The 31,000 died slowly. I think it is appropriate to slow the telling down at least this far. The Ashen Covenant came out of transit at 0340 hours the following morning. I was on rest cycle when the proximity alert sounded, and I was on the bridge in 4 minutes in my uniform with my boots half-laced and the duty log open on the secondary station before I fully understood what I was seeing on the forward viewport. 370,000 warships do not emerge from transit instantaneously. The transit calculation for a fleet that size, even using the distributed emergence protocol that spreads the formation across a broad volume to reduce transit point stress, takes 11 minutes from first emergence to last. I watched all 11 of those minutes. I watched the ships come out of the transit shimmer, the pale blue-white distortion that marks a transit aperture in normal space. First in groups of hundreds, then thousands. Then the sensor display simply stopped trying to render individual contacts and showed instead a density gradient, a color, a field of presence. The lead vessel was EF Covenant's Edge. I did not know its name at the time. I learned it later from the records. It was a Dominion-class fleet carrier, 2 kilometers long, its hull the dark gray of deep-worked alloy with the faint surface oxidation that comes from years in vacuum service, and it's settled into position approximately 40,000 kilometers from the debris field with a precision of movement that I found, even in that moment, extraordinary. The kind of precision that comes not from exceptional seamanship, but from a crew that has been running transit drills for every hour of the 4 weeks it took to assemble this fleet and move it here. Captain Morrow accepted the hailing frequency at 0356 hours. I did not hear what was said. I was at the secondary station with the duty log, and the communication was conducted on an encrypted channel on the command set, and I was not part of it. What I observed was the captain's posture over the course of about 8 minutes. She stood without moving, and she spoke twice, and both times she spoke briefly, and when the channel closed, she stood for a moment longer, and then turned and walked to the viewport and looked at the fleet the way I had looked at the debris field 18 hours before. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she said, to the room, not to anyone specifically, "We stay with the fleet for the transit. Documentation continues." I wrote 0356 hours. EFS Covenant's Edge has made contact. Ashen Covenant fleet formation now complete. 370,000 warships logged by sensor array. Distributed emergence confirmed. Formation holding at 40,000 kilometers from debris field. Captain Morrow conducting coordination. Kerath's measure to accompany fleet on transit. Duty log to remain active and continuous. Then I added, in the notation field that was technically reserved for equipment status. Debris field visible on aft viewport as we come about. I will note it for the record. It is a field of residue in open space where a community of 31,000 once maintained a park deck and a fountain. The soil from that deck is visible on the spectral analysis at bearing 274 Mark 11. The Varrock process rejected it. I have logged its coordinates precisely. The transit to the Varrock home system took 9 days. I should describe those 9 days because they are part of the story and because they are the part that is least often described. The Ashen Covenant was not a tense fleet in transit. It was not a fleet at battle readiness in the way you might imagine from the outside. Gun crews at stations, alarms on half-cycle, the heightened alertness of a force preparing to engage a capable enemy. The Varrock Syndicate had demonstrated, through what they did to Kerath Station, that they were dangerous and methodical and possessed of significant biological and chemical capability. But they were not a peer military force. They had no warships in any configuration that matched the Covenant's assets. What they had was the capability to do what they had done, to move slowly, covertly, and to consume. The fleet was calm, that is the word. I ate meals in the officers' mess with Lieutenant Commander Yeva Solberg and Ensign Deo Atacola, and the measure's chief engineer, a heavyset man named Pyotr Babich, who had been with the ship for 12 years, and who played cards badly and enthusiastically every evening in the common room, and we talked about things that were not the fleet, and things that were the fleet, and the boundary between those two categories shifted depending on what day it was and what the sensor displays were showing. Pyotr had a daughter who was 11. She had sent him a voice message the week before we reached the debris field, and he had played it in the common room without quite meaning to, reaching for something on the table, brushing the playback control, and we had all heard about 8 seconds of an 11-year-old explaining at some length why a certain type of deep space rock formation was her current primary interest, before he fumbled it off. Nobody commented on it. That is the kind of thing that happens on a ship of 112 people after 11 months together. The 11-year-old's name was apparently Katya, and she had, according to Pyotr, opinions on a wide range of geological topics, and he had apparently no idea where she had gotten that from. I logged the duty records every morning and every evening. I slept 7 hours a night because Captain Morrow told me during the second day's briefing that anyone on her bridge who was running on less than 7 hours was a liability, and she intended to keep her crew above that threshold for the duration. She meant it. She checked. When Ensign Adekola showed up to the morning briefing on the third day, looking hollowed out, and explained that he had been awake since 0200 running, numbers on the debris spectrals analysis, because he could not stop thinking about the analysis. and the numbers were not adding up the way he needed them to add up. The captain told him to hand the analysis to Dr. Osi, who had the relevant qualification, and to go sleep for 4 hours and then come back. He did. The numbers, as it turned out, were adding up exactly as they appeared to be adding up, and the reason Adicola could not make them add up differently was that there was no different way for them to add up, and that was the hardest part of the analysis, which Dr. Osi noted in her report with the same direct precision she applied to everything. On the 5th day in transit, I asked Captain Morrow, privately after the evening briefing, when the other officers had filed out and it was the two of us and the hum of the transit systems, whether she thought what we were doing was right. She looked at me for a moment, not the evaluative look of an officer assessing a subordinate's fitness. Something else. Define right, she said. I didn't have an immediate answer to that, which was probably why I'd asked the question in the first place. I said something about proportionality, about the size of the fleet relative to what we knew of the Varroca's military capacity, about whether 370,000 warships was a judgment or an extinction, about whether those two things were, in this particular case, the same thing, and whether that sameness was intended, and by whom, and at what level that intention had been formed. She thought about it. She was not the kind of person who gave quick answers to questions that didn't have quick answers. I've been in command for 22 years, she said. I've logged 247 incidents in that time. 11 of them were serious enough that someone on my crew or someone I was trying to help died. I have thought about proportionality in connection with every one of those 11 incidents for the rest of the time I've been alive. I don't have a formula. She looked at the viewport on the far bulkhead, transit space, the unremarkable visual field of faster-than-light travel, that uniform non-color that tells you nothing about where you are or how far you have come. What I know, she said, is that 31,000 people were filed as salvage. Filed. The word was chosen. And whoever chose it knew they were choosing it in reference to people. That's what I keep coming back to. I asked her whether she thought the Varroc understood, when they chose the word, that they were making a gamble, that the gap between filing and consequence might close faster than their legal framework could absorb. She considered that for a long moment. The transit hum was the only sound. I think, she said carefully, that they believed the framework was the protection. They had registered. They had filed correctly every step of the way except the step they exploited. From inside their own logic, the framework was real. They were inside it, operating within it, and they expected the framework to function as advertised. She paused. They didn't account for the gap between what the framework permits and what we do. Those are not the same thing. They haven't been the same thing for a long time. I asked her how long. She didn't answer that directly. What she said was, write it down accurately. That's the job. Whatever you conclude, write it down accurately and let whoever comes after us decide what to call it. She went back to her station and I went back to the duty log and I wrote down what she had said as accurately as I could. I kept coming back to it too. I kept coming back to it for the entire 9 days, and I have not, in the 14 years since, entirely stopped coming back to it. The mechanism of the word, the decision inside it, whatever assessment of humanity the Varroc made, in the weeks between waking and filing, whatever they concluded about what we were, what category we fit, what claim we had on consideration, that assessment produced the word substrate. I do not know how to model the interior of that assessment. I have read the xenobiological analyses, and they have not given me a model I trust. What I have is the word, and the number, and the enumeration, and the processing duration logged for each of the 31,412, beginning with Faranaz Amadi Keller. The Varroc Syndicate transmitted on the 4th day of our transit. The message was addressed to the Ashen Covenant Fleet Command and copied to the Interstellar Commons Registry and to the External Settlement Command Communications Hub and to 3 other governmental and quasi-governmental bodies whose names I logged but whose functions I was less familiar with. It was lengthy. I read the full text because the captain routed it to the bridge officers for awareness, and I read it 3 times over the course of that day, each time taking notes in the margin of my working copy, trying to understand both what it said and what it was trying to do by saying it. It was a legal document, not a plea and not an apology and not a declaration of war. A legal document in the technical sense that it engaged the framework of the commons law under which the original claim had been filed, cited specific provisions and annexures, and made a formal argument. The argument was that the Varrock's actions at Kerath Station had been conducted within the parameters of legally recognized commons provisions, that humanity's military response constituted a violation of commons conflict, protocols requiring prior arbitration, that the Ashen Covenant's deployment without arbitration proceedings was itself an actionable breach, and that the Varrock Syndicate formally requested an immediate cessation of fleet movement pending Commons tribunal review. I read it carefully. I am not a legal expert, and I noted that limitation in my own thinking as I read, but I understood enough of it to understand the structure of the argument, and the structure of the argument was coherent. It cited real provisions. It identified real procedural requirements. It was the work of something that understood the framework it was operating within, that had in fact designed its conduct at Kerath Station to operate within the framework, gap by gap, margin by margin. The 9-day registration laps the hinge pin of everything. What struck me, reading it the third time, was what it did not contain. It did not contain the word substrate. It did not contain the number 31,412. It did not reference the Varrock's own enumeration records or the processing durations or the sequential numbering system by which each person had been logged. It engaged the legal framework with precision, and it was entirely silent about the specific contents of the Protocol 11 records, which I had read in full and which I had archived to 3 copies on the measure's storage systems. The legal argument and the numbered list of substrate units were both real. The transmission chose only one of them to present. The Covenant's fleet command did not respond. I logged the transmission in full and noted the absence of response. On the 6th day, the Varrock transmitted again. This message was different. It was shorter. It cited fewer provisions and spent more of its length describing the population of the Varrock home system. 6 worlds, the largest with a mass of approximately 240 million Varrock in various stages of the hive cycle, the smallest a nursery system of newly emerged units numbering in the tens of millions. It described the Varrock's dormancy period and characterized it as an involuntary state, something that had happened to them rather than a choice, and it described their emergence into a populated galaxy as disorienting. That word appeared in the translation, disorienting, and it described Protocol 11 in terms that I can only call clinical self-justification. A survival mechanism, evolved over millennia, applied in conditions of acute resource scarcity and territorial uncertainty. I logged it. I noted the word disorienting. I noted the phrase survival mechanism. I noted that in the entire text of both transmissions, the word substrate did not appear, and neither did the number 31,412, and neither did any of the numbered entries in the Varrock's own records that we had recovered from the Commons filing and archived. I noted these absences formally, in the duty log, in the section I headed Transmission Analysis, which was not a standard duty log section, but which I created because there was something I wanted the record to contain that the standard sections did not have space for. I shared the transmission analysis with Captain Morrow over breakfast on the 7th day. She read it without comment. Then she said, "Keep going. Whatever you need to note, note it." I kept going. On the 8th day, the 3rd transmission arrived. It was 4 lines. I am going to log it here because I logged it in the duty record and because I believe it should be part of any honest account of this period. The Varrock Syndicate, in its 3rd transmission to the Ashen Covenant, stated that it acknowledged the loss of the biological units at the Kerath installation, that it expressed that it understood this loss to be the proximate cause of the current military action, that it wished to convey its willingness to negotiate terms for cessation, and that it asked the Fleet Command to consider, in determining its response, the population of the 6 home worlds and the asymmetry of consequence between humanity's loss of 31,000 units and the Varrock's loss of 240 million. That was the 3rd transmission. I sat with it for a while after logging it. I noted that the 3rd transmission was the first to use a number, 240 million, and to make the asymmetry explicit. I noted that the first transmission had not acknowledged the Kerath dead at all. I noted the phrase biological units, which appeared in the third transmission in reference to the 31,000 people of Kerath Station, and which was a different word from substrate, but occupied a similar category in whatever taxonomy the Varrock used to think about what humans were. I noted all of this without editorial comment because that is how a duty log works. The observations go in. The interpretation is for someone else. The fleet did not respond to the third transmission. On the 9th day, we came out of transit at the Varrock home system boundary, and I stood at the viewport on the bridge of the Kerath's measure and looked at what 370,000 warships look like when they are deployed in formation that the Covenant's tactical staff had apparently been refining for 3 weeks. I cannot describe it with any precision that does it justice, because the scale is not a thing language handles well, not mine anyway. What I can say is that the formation was a sphere, approximately a rough sphere, surrounding the home system's primary star at a distance, calibrated to place each of the 6 inhabited worlds within the effective range of a specific subsection of the fleet. Not a line, not a wedge, a sphere, something that enclosed, something that stated geometrically, before a single ship moved or a single system fired, what the answer was going to be. I wrote in the duty log, formation complete. Kerath's measure at outer boundary, bearing 142 Mark 37. Sensor array displaying full Covenant formation. The formation is a sphere. I want the record to note that the formation is a sphere because I believe the geometry is significant. And because in 14 years of thinking about this, I have come to believe that the sphere was a deliberate communication and not merely a tactical choice, and I want that observation to exist somewhere, attached to the correct date. The first wave began at 0600 hours, local fleet coordination time. I have no direct observation of what happened on the 6 worlds. The Kerath's measure was positioned in the outer formation, well beyond the engagement threshold, and my viewport showed me the fleet and the distant light of the primary star and the sensor display showing the telemetry returns. What the sensor display showed was attrition, the progressive reduction of active Varrock signatures across the 6 worlds in the order in which the engagement subfleets were deployed. The largest world went first. I logged its designation as the Covenant's tactical documentation rendered it, Varrock Primary 1. I logged the timestamp at which the sensors showed a change in the signature profile, and I logged the subsequent readings at 15-minute intervals as the profile continued to change. And I did not permit myself to be imprecise about what changing signature profiles represented when applied to inhabited worlds, because the duty log is not a place for imprecision. I used the correct words. There is a kind of numbness that sets in after the first few hours of watching a telemetry display record, something irreversible. I do not mean emotional numbness in the sense of dissociation or shock. I mean the specific cognitive state that sets in when you have been looking at the same kind of information for long enough that the information begins to feel like information rather than like what it represents. I was aware of this happening. I noted it in my own working notation as a thing to guard against. Each reading at each 15-minute interval represented a world that had held whatever the Varrock held. Their history, their biology, their 6,000 years of sleeping, and their short and catastrophic year of being awake. And I tried consciously to hold that in front of each entry rather than behind it, to let the weight of what I was logging remain attached to the logging. Whether I succeeded at that fully, I cannot say. I can say that I tried, and that the trying felt like the correct thing to do. The nursery world was last. I logged it the same way. Between the largest world and the nursery world, at approximately the 4th hour of the engagement, the Varrock transmitted a 4th time. This message arrived on an Open Commons broadcast frequency, addressed to no one in particular, or everyone simultaneously. A transmission that was, not this time, a legal document or a plea or a negotiation, but simply a statement, lengthy and in some places difficult to translate, that appeared to be a record of the Varrock's history, their origin in the deep cold, their dormancy, what the dormancy had been like, if the word like could be applied to the interior state of a distributed hive consciousness across 6,000 years of cold suspension. the species they had assimilated before humanity, which turned out to number 4, and which the Varrock described with the same notational detachment they had applied to the Kerath station enumeration, though in this context, the detachment read differently. The extent of their territory before the sleep, the things they had known and the things they had forgotten. The specific texture of waking into a galaxy that had continued without them, full of architectures and frameworks they had not been present to observe being built. The transmission lasted approximately 90 minutes. I logged it in full. I want to be honest about what I experienced while I was logging it. There was something in it that was not nothing. I cannot characterize it more precisely than that. I do not know if what I experienced while reading it was a response to the Varrock themselves, to whatever it is they were, or a response to the idea of 6,000 years of cold suspension and waking into a changed world, which is a comprehensible enough experience in its bones, even if the scale is unimaginable. I do not know if any of what they transmitted was intended to produce that response, or whether intention is even a concept that maps accurately onto the Varrock's cognition. I logged it and I returned to the telemetry. Captain Morrow sat at her station throughout the engagement and read the telemetry feeds and said nothing for the 11 hours and 22 minutes. It took the Covenant to complete its work. At one point, perhaps 6 hours in, Pyotr Babbich came to the bridge, which was not his station during an engagement. There was nothing for a chief engineer to do at that moment, and stood near the aft station for perhaps 10 minutes and watched the telemetry and then left without speaking to anyone. Dr. O.C. came up at the 8th hour with coffee for the bridge crew, which was an act of care so straightforward and so characteristic of her that it required no interpretation. She poured the coffee and set the cups on the appropriate consoles and went back to medical. The nursery world went quiet at 2122 hours. At 2140 hours, Captain Morrow stood and said to the bridge, "Engagement complete. Prepare for transit home. Cadet Lieutenant Vale, close out the duty log." I sat at the secondary station for a moment before I wrote anything. The viewport showed the outer formation reforming around us as the fleet began to organize for the return transit. 370,000 warships repositioning with the same precision they had maintained throughout, the geometry of it calm and exact. The light from the Varrock primary star was unchanged. Stars do not change because of what happens around them. The debris of the engagement was distributed across the system in patterns that the sensor array logged with the same notational indifference it applied to everything else. I thought about the 11 minutes it had taken the fleet to emerge from transit that first morning at the debris field. The way the sensor displays had simply stopped trying to render individual contacts and shown a color instead. A field of presence. I thought about what it meant that humanity had built that fleet and assembled it in 4 weeks and moved it 9 transit days across the space. Between here and there and deployed it in a sphere around a primary star and conducted 11 hours and 22 minutes of methodical, precise engagement. I thought about Pyotr standing at the aft station for 10 minutes with nothing to do, watching the telemetry, and then going back below. About Ensign Adekola sitting in the common room at 0200 trying to make numbers add up differently than they added up. About Dr. Osi bringing coffee at the 8th hour because that was the kind of thing she did when there was nothing else to be done. I thought about the word disorienting. I thought about the school on level 7 and the soil brought up from Kalius 9 and the ornamental fountain and the 12-bed medical bay and Farinaz Amadi Keller, who was 62 years old and was the school principal and was substrate unit number 1. I thought about Tamsin Orval, 41, who had filed the wrong processing code and had a correction drafted in the outbound queue. I thought about all the other numbers between 1 and 31,412 and the names that matched them that I had spent 18 hours cross-referencing into the duty log at the debris field. I opened the duty log and I wrote, "Engagement of Varrock Home System completed 122 hours local fleet coordination time. All 6 inhabited bodies reduced to non-active status per Ashen Covenant operational parameters. Fleet reforming for return transit. Full telemetry records archived to primary, secondary, and relay buffer per standing orders. Varrock 4th transmission received and logged in full during engagement. Fourth hour, open broadcast frequency, historical record of Varrock origin and prior assimilation events, filed under transmission log reference T4. Then I sat for a moment longer because the notation field was still open, and I had one more thing I wanted to write, and I wanted to be honest about it, and I was trying to find the right words. I have thought about what I wrote next many times. I have had people ask me about it after the after-action review that pulled the log into the official record, and I have tried each time to explain what I was trying to do by writing it, and I have not always managed to explain it well. I was 23 years old. I had been a junior officer for 11 months. I had spent the past 11 days watching 31,000 people get counted and a hive of several hundred million get answered for it, and I was trying to write something honest about what I had observed and what I thought about it and what I did not know. This is what I wrote and what went into the official record. The Ashen Covenant's engagement of the Varrock Syndicate home system is now complete. I do not have a word for what this was, not in any language I know. The words that exist for what humans do when we respond to the death of our people, justice, retaliation, war, reckoning, none of them quite hold all of what I watched happen today. I know what the 31,000 were. I know what they were called by the entity that processed them. I know that the entity that called them that no longer exists. I do not know what the right word is for the relationship between those two facts. I know that we received 3 legal transmissions across 9 days of transit, and we did not respond to any of them. I know that on the 4th transmission, they stopped filing documents and began telling us who they were, and I know that we were already inside the formation by then. I know that not having a word for a thing has not slowed us down, not once, in all the years of our history. I know that we did not hesitate. I know that this will not be the last time we are given a reason not to hesitate. I know that the fleet is reforming around us with the same precision it has maintained throughout, and that the precision is the message, and that whoever is left in this galaxy to observe it will understand the message correctly. I am closing the duty log now. Cadet Lieutenant Soren Vale, EFS Kerath's measure, duty complete. I closed the log and I saved it to 3 archives. Captain Morrow did not comment on the notation. Not that evening, and not during the 9 days of return transit, and not when we reached ESC Fleet Command at Callista and the log was pulled for formal review. 3 weeks later, I was called to a meeting with the review board, and the presiding officer, a gray-haired fleet rear admiral named Ayonu Chandra, who had the look of a woman who had been doing this work for 40 years and expected to do it for another 10, looked at me across the table with the duty log open on the display in front of her and said, regarding the final notation, "Do you stand by this?" I said that I did. She looked at it for a moment longer. Then she said, "It goes in the record as written," and it did. I was promoted to lieutenant the following year and transferred to an ESC patrol vessel, and have spent the 14 years since doing the work of someone who files reports and maintains logs and observes things carefully and tries to write them down accurately. The work has taken me to 32 postings across 4 sectors. I have logged 17,000 hours of documentation. I have been on scene for 9 subsequent incidents of varying severity, and I have written every one of them into the record with the same block lettering the Academy taught me, filling in the columns because the column expect to be filled, and because filled columns, done accurately, are a form of respect for the events they record. I have tried across all of it to write things down in a way that does not make them easier than they are. I have not returned to the coordinates where Kerath Station was. The debris field has been formally designated and logged and is maintained as a restricted zone under ESC protocol. There is a proposal, still in committee the last time I checked, to install a beacon there with the 31,412 names on it. I hope it passes. I think the names should be there, in the place where they ended, even if the place is now only a volume of space and a collection of residue that the Varrock's process left behind because it couldn't find a use for it. I think the soil from level 7 should be noted specifically with its coordinates and the analysis that showed the Varrock process rejected it. The record should be complete in the same way a duty log is complete. Nothing omitted because it was inconvenient to include. I think about Faranaz Amadi Keller sometimes. Substrate Unit Number 1. I have read what the record says about her. That she was born on the surface of Kalius 9 and had been at the station for 18 years and had been the school principal for 9 of them and had submitted a proposal to expand the school's science curriculum 6 weeks before the dispersant reached effective concentration in the water supply. The proposal had been approved by the station's administrative board and was sitting alongside Tamsin, Orval's outbound correction, in the queue waiting to be transmitted to the ESC educational office when the dispersant reached its first effective concentration. I do not know anything else about her. I know her name and I know her number, and I know that the science curriculum proposal was approved and never transmitted, and I know that she was first, which may mean that she was the first person to encounter dispersant at sufficient concentration, or it may mean something else about the Varrock's enumeration methodology that the xenobiologists were not able to fully determine. I know that when I wrote her registration number into the duty log at Callisto, entering it as the first of the 31,412 individual cross-references, in the ESC formal filing, I wrote it carefully, in block lettering. The same block lettering they teach you at the academy. The same lettering I had used to write my own name and rank at the top of the log that first morning, before anything had happened, when the columns still expected to be filled. I filled them. The Ashen Covenant has been decommissioned as an operational fleet designation since the engagement. The warships returned to their home commands. The Covenant's edge was assigned to the Northern Transit Patrol. The 370,000 ships dispersed across the fleet catalog and went back to the work of whatever they had been doing before the assembly order went out. I see their class designations sometimes in the operational updates. I see the hull numbers. I do not have any particular feeling about them that I can name cleanly, and I have stopped trying to name it cleanly because I do not think the feeling is the kind that has a clean name. What I know is this. The Varrock Syndicate filed 31,412 people as salvage on a 9-day clerical lapse and processed them with a thoroughness that left nothing behind but the soil. From a level 7 park and some structural alloys and a registry entry the Commons Tribunal subsequently declared fraudulent. The Ashen Covenant answered that with 370,000 warships organized in a sphere around a primary star in 11 hours, and 22 minutes of methodical, precise work, the disproportion is real, and I am not going to argue it away. The proportionality question is real, and I am not going to argue it away either. What I am going to say is what I said in the duty log. I do not have the word for what it was. I have looked for it for 14 years. I have read the tribunal proceedings and the ESC after-action review and the 3 separate ethical assessments commissioned by the Commons in the following years, and none of them have a word for it either. They have frameworks. They have analyses. They have conclusions that go several directions simultaneously. They have the phrase necessary and proportionate, which the 3rd assessment uses, and which I have read carefully, and which I understand the argument for, and which I cannot, 14 years later, fully accept or fully reject. What they all agree on in the parts that matter, that the Varrock chose the word they used, that they knew the word they were using, that substrate is a word with a meaning, and that the meaning was not accidental, and that the entities who chose it understood the difference between a substrate unit and a person, and made a decision about which category to apply. I think about that decision sometimes. I think about what it must require, what it must do to a cognition, or what it must reflect that is already there. To look at 31,000 people living in a station with a school and a park and a 12-bed, medical bay and a fountain and an approved curriculum proposal in an outbound queue, and choose the word substrate, to enumerate them, to begin at number 1 and proceed in order through 31,412. I think about the precision of the sphere. I think about how both things are true simultaneously and how neither one cancels the other out, and how that is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about what happened, and how it is entirely possible that the most honest thing I can say is not enough, and how not being enough has never once stopped us from saying it anyway. We are humanity. We count our dead. We name them. We fill in the columns. We do not accept the reclassification. What happens next, we do not always have a word for. We do it anyway.